Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Brittany Lee the Bio Geek. My name is Brittany, and today we're going to be going over the skeletal system. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of orient you guys to what each one of the bones are, what they articulate with. That way, when I move on to my more specific videos going over the landmarks, you're at least oriented to what each one of these bones are. So the skeletal system is broken up into two major components. We have the axial skeleton, which is going to sit in the midline. It's going to contain the sternum, the rib cage, the vertebral column, and the sacrum and the coccyx. The appendicular skeleton is going to be your limbs, your limb girdles, so your shoulder girdle, your arm bones, your hip girdles, and your leg bones, as well as the hands and the feet. So what I want to do is just kind of walk you guys from the top down what each of these bones are, what they articulate with. That way, whenever you start learning landmarks, you've at least made it through this stage here. So let's start on the anterior or front side of the body first. In the midline, we're going to have the sternum. Now, the sternum is broken up into three parts. The more square part is going to be the manubrium. The larger, more thin part is going to be the body. And then at the very tip, you're going to have the xiphoid process. Next, we have the vertebrae, which are located in the posterior of the body. You have three different types of vertebrae. You have the cervical vertebrae, which are going to meet the base of the skull and go all the way to the upper back. There are seven cervical vertebrae. Next, you're going to have the thoracic vertebrae, which are going to make up the majority of the back. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. And then making up the lower back, you're going to have your lumbar vertebrae, which you have 5. So 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and then 5 lumbar. Now, if you follow this vertebral column down to the bottom, you'll see the sacrum. The sacrum is going to be part of the vertebral column, or not part of it, but it's going to articulate or connect with the vertebral column, specifically with L5. Now, the sacrum still contains some holes, or foramina or holes, through which the spinal nerves can exit. Now, at the very tip of the sacrum, you have this tiny little tail-like bone. That's going to be called the coccyx. Now, let's turn this baby back around. So, next you're going to have your ribs. Now, you have three different types of ribs. True versus false is the first sort of indication. The first 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, are going to be your true ribs, and the last 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are going to be your false ribs. Now, the true ribs are true because they articulate directly to the sternum itself. So these are going to be called vertebrosternal ribs. That's your first 7. Now, the next 3 are going to be what's called vertebrochondral ribs, meaning that the vertebrochondral, meaning that the rib is going to articulate posteriorly with the vertebrae, and then anteriorly with cartilage that connects to the sternum. Now, the last 2 ribs are called vertebral ribs or floating ribs, and these 2 ribs only articulate or connect with the vertebrae in the back. They're floating, so they don't have any anterior articulations. Now, let's go into the shoulder girdle. Now, the shoulder girdle is going to consist of the clavicle, which are your collarbones, the scapula, which is your shoulder blades, and then the humerus, which is going to be that upper arm bone. So scapula is going to be in the back, clavicle is going to be in the front, and then your humerus is going to be that first upper arm bone. Now, remember, the anatomical position is feet facing and body facing forward, arms by their sides with the palms facing forward. This is important whenever we move down to the lower arm bones. Now, with your arms facing forward and palms out, you'll notice that on the lateral or outside, you have your thumb. So if you look at this bone, these set of bones in the forearm, what you have is on the thumb side, you have the radius, and on the pinky side, you have the ulna. So just remember, ulna with the pinky, radius with the thumb, and make sure your hands are in anatomical position when doing so. Now, moving distally or farther away from the site of origin, you're going to have your carpals. The carpals are your wrist bones. Now, I'm not going to go over individual carpals today because it's too hard to see them on this video. However, whenever I go over the hand and the wrist, I will go over each one of the carpals more in depth and how you can tell them apart whenever they're attached to a hand. So moving more distally from the carpals, we have the metacarpals, which are going to make up most of the palm. And then even more distally from the metacarpals, you're going to have your phalanges, or the fingertips. Now, the thumb only has a proximal and a distal phalange. However, the rest of them, your index, your middle, your ring finger, and your pinky finger, those all have both a proximal and a distal, as well as an intermediate that's located in between the proximal and distal phalanges. So stay tuned for that arm video because it's going to be a dense one. Now, we mentioned we had the sacrum and the coccyx, which is nestled in between the hip girdle, or the hip bones. So the hip bones, or the pelvic bones, are actually made up of 3 distinct bones. Anteriorly towards the front, we're going to have the ilium. So if you touched your hip bones in the front, that would be the ilium up here. More situated towards the back, we're going to have the ischium. The ischium is the tailbone. So if you ever bruised your tailbone, it was probably the ischium. And then lastly, located most inferiorly and anteriorly, you're going to have the pubic bone. And I'll cover this again in more detail in my next videos. Next, articulating or connecting into the socket of the hip, you're going to have your long bone of the thigh, which is going to be the femur. You follow that bone more distally, you're going to see 2 bones of the shin. The more medial of the 2 and the more thick or dense of the 2 is going to be the tibia. And then located on the lateral side, the smaller and weaker of those 2 is going to be the fibula. I always think about the fibula kind of like a joke, and it's smaller than the tibia, so the fibula is kind of like a joke of the lower leg bones. Now moving on to the feet, just like we saw in the hands where we had carpals of the wrist, we're going to have tarsals in the foot. Now I'm going to go more into detail of those whenever I cover the foot and the ankle in more detail. But just as we saw in the hands, we have metatarsals, which make up the most of the arch of the foot. And then we're going to have phalanges. So proximal, intermediate, and distal for the 4. And then for the big toe, also called the hallux, we'll see that there's only a proximal and a distal phalange. Now you might have noticed that I missed this tiny sesamoid bone that sits on top of the knee. This is going to be the patella, which is nestled in between 2 ligaments of the leg. And then the last bone that I missed is going to be the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a bone that does not articulate with any other bone in the body. It's located up here in the throat region, and it's really important for swallowing and speaking. So that's all of the bones. Stay tuned for my next video where I cover the skull, including all of the bones and all of the landmarks of the skull. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.